Hello, everybody, and welcome and welcome to this first ever BAS Facebook Live event, where we're trying to talk with one of the authors of from our winter issue of Biblical Archaeology Review, Tom Schmidt, who wrote the very fascinating and interesting article, Calculating Christmas, Hippolytus and December 25th. It was really the very fascinating cover story from our winter issue. And we're very fortunate that Tom is here to join us to answer reader questions. The reader questions have been submitted online and through our Facebook page. And so we're very happy to have Tom here. My name is Glenn Corbett. I'm the editor-in-chief of Biblical Archaeology Review. And along with me co-hosting this event is Megan Sauter, who's our managing editor. And she will be here with me asking Tom some of our reader questions. So very briefly, I just want to introduce Tom. Tom is assistant professor of New Testament and early Christianity at Fairfield University in Connecticut. He earned his PhD from Yale and has a broad range of research interests, including the historical Jesus, the formation of the New Testament, and the history of Christianity in the Syriac and Arabic traditions. He is currently preparing a monograph titled Josephus and Jesus, published through Oxford University Press. So welcome, Tom, and we appreciate you being with us. Just a very quick note to those who might be watching the event live on Facebook. All questions have been submitted in advance of this on Facebook and social media, so we will not be taking questions live through the Facebook chat, but we do welcome your comments and inquiries just to have there in the chat so we can see them. So please feel free to comment as you like, though we won't be taking those questions live. So we thought it'd be a good idea to have Tom very briefly introduce and summarize his article from the winter issue of BAR and some of his key points and arguments. So Tom, can you mind doing that for those who weren't able to actually read the article?
Yeah, sure thing. And first, I just want to say thank you, Glenn and Megan, for having me. It's a delight to be here. My article is on how Christmas came to be on December 25th. I think, as most of your readers will be aware, there's this common belief that December 25th was an ancient Roman pagan holiday, and that the ancient church, wanting to please pagan sentiments, kind of christened or baptized that holiday, made it the birthday of Jesus in order to attract pagans to come to Christianity. That's something I actually used to believe too. But in my article, what I show is that there was a Roman man named Hippolytus. He's known as Hippolytus of Rome. He wrote in the early 200s AD. He was a Christian. And he says in one of his works that Jesus was born on December 25th. And that's interesting because the Roman festivals on December 25th didn't exist yet in the early 200s. That was a later development. So if Hippolytus had said that, it would mean that he must have had some other reason to select that date for the birthday of Jesus. But there's also a problem that in this book of Hippolytus, where he says Jesus was born on December 25th, there's some manuscript variants. So some variants say December 25th, some have a different date. What we need to do is look at Hippolytus's other works to see when he thought Jesus was born. And that's what I do in the article. I walk through some of his other statements, and it becomes clear that Hippolytus thought that Jesus was conceived, the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary on the Passover, and that he was therefore born, about 9 months later. 9 months from the Passover is around late December, early January. And another data point I draw from is that Hippolytus also seems to have believed that Jesus was born 9 months from what he thought was the anniversary of the world's creation. He thought that happened on the vernal equinox, March 25th, and 9 months after that is December 25th. So all these data points work together to suggest that Hippolytus thought that Jesus was born on December 25th, and he seems to have thought this because he felt like he could calculate Jesus's birth from the Passover, and it's a little mysterious. We might get into that later on about why he thought Jesus was conceived on the Passover, but he had this belief, and that was shared by many other early Christians as well. And the Passover moves around in the calendar a little bit, depending on the year, but 9 months from there is about December 25th. And if you're Hippolytus and you peg it March 25th, and you think Jesus had a perfect 9 months gestational period, then you get to December 25th. So that's what I argue about for in the article.
And that's an excellent segue into our first reader question or comment, and it sort of goes to the gist of kind of that first data point. How did the early church fathers, including Hippolytus, arrive at Passover as the date of Jesus' conception? What information do we have that they were really emphasizing Passover as the sort of key conception date?
It's mysterious. We don't really know. We know that early on there was a fair amount of unity in the early church. So I'm talking about the church in the late 100s, early 200s, that they thought that the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary on the Passover. Why they thought that is like I said, mysterious. It could be that they're drawing on more ancient traditions that are undocumented. Luke mentions Mary treasured these things in her heart. He says that a couple times. Maybe they're drawing from earlier traditions. There's other indications, though, that they're also doing kind of similar, I could say, calculating or numerological beliefs. So, for example, they seem to have liked the idea that Jesus, the Son of God, was conceived the day the world was created, on the anniversary of the world's creation. They thought that symbolized a very profound spiritual moment. There's others who do other calculations. They thought that, for instance, Luke mentions that on the baptism of Jesus, that Jesus was 30 years old. Now, Luke says about 30, but some Christians interpreted that really literally. They thought he was 30 years to the day. And then when Luke said that Jesus proclaimed an acceptable year of the Lord, I think that's in Luke 5 or 6, maybe Luke 4, they thought it was literally 1 year. So he was baptized, and then 365 days later, he was crucified. He was crucified on the Passover, which means he must have began his life on the Passover to be exactly 31 years old. But they thought that was the conception, not birth. Some of these reasonings we don't exactly track with these days, but they make these kinds of arguments. And they made other calculations involving John the Baptist, which we might get into later. But in some, it's pretty mysterious. We don't know where they're getting this from. And they give diverse reasons for that date. We don't really know what the originating cause was.
Oh, thank you for that explanation. Megan, do you want to take the next question?
Sure. Many of our readers pointed out that in the Gospels, it talks about the shepherds watching their flocks at night. However, supposedly shepherds don't do this during the winter, but instead keep them in caves. How do we reconcile that with the birth date of December 25th?
Yeah, that comes up a lot. That's in Luke, the Gospel of Luke. Luke mentions that the shepherds on the day of Jesus' birth were out watching their flocks in the fields. And the Greek word for that, it's a fair translation. It's an uncommon Greek word. It's agrero, and it seems to indicate they were outside. They were out of doors. They weren't inside houses. So I have to say that I think in order to show that shepherds in ancient Israel would not have been out of doors, we'd have to have some pretty good ancient evidence for that in the month of December they weren't shepherding their flocks outside. I've heard that contemporary shepherds in Israel go indoors in the month of December, but we don't really know what ancient shepherding practices were. So it's I think a little tenuous to make that assumption. For instance, even today, shepherds will be outside. And when we use the term someone's outside watching the flocks, we don't always mean they were just lying under the stars. They might have had a tent or a shed or something. So I think it's a bit tenuous. I will say, though, that I'm arguing what the early church believed about the birth of Jesus, which is different from when Jesus actually was born. So I don't claim to know that. It might have been December 25th, but there's other possibilities. So I guess I would say I think the evidence from Luke about the shepherds is a little tenuous to date, to mark exactly the month Jesus was born.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
And I would say, based on my own personal experience hanging out in the desert in the winter and spring months that there are certainly some Bedouin out there with their herds herding away. So
That's good to know. Yeah.
Next reader question, and one I might have a follow-up on as well, is, as you mentioned in your article, there were slight disagreements on the precise dating of Christmas among the early church fathers. When does December 25th become the dominant date?
Well, we're fortunate that we can kind of track this with a good deal of precision. And that's because John Chrysostom, he's a famous ancient Christian preacher. He preached a sermon in 386 in Antioch, 386 AD. And we have this sermon. And it's a Christmas Day sermon. And in it, John Chrysostom says that the date of December 25th is a new date for them in Antioch for the birthday of Jesus. They used to celebrate this date on a different day, it probably in early January. And he says, we only started doing this about 10 years ago. But he said, but it recently, this date has spread all over the place. So everybody's following this date now. So that seems to indicate that towards the end of the 300s, certainly in the 400s, the date of December 25th was becoming quite prevalent. John also says in this sermon that the Church of Antioch obtained this date from the Roman Church. And he said that the Romans have been doing this for a very, very long time. So from John's perspective, that must be at least 60, 70, 80 years or even way, way before then. So I would say December 25th started to become prevalent in the late 300s, early 400s. It never, even to this day, has become universal. There's still some churches, especially the Armenian church, that celebrate Christmas in early January. There's other churches that, from the perspective of those who follow the Gregorian calendar, celebrate Christmas on a different day. But that is because they follow the Julian calendar. These are some of the Eastern churches. And for them, they do celebrate Christmas on December 25th, but their December 25th is 2 weeks after the Western December 25th. So you still get a diversity of dates, but it does seem by the 400s, December 25th was becoming the prevalent date.
And my slightly sort of follow-on question to that was, you mentioned in your article that a couple of other early church fathers who were either slightly earlier, maybe contemporary with Hippolytus, like you mentioned specifically Clement of Alexandria, were coming to kind of similar calculations. And it just occurred to me, were they in conversation with each other? Were they reaching similar conclusions? Like, do we have any sense of what those dialogues were about in terms of reaching this consensus or understanding?
That's a great question. There's a lot of possibilities and circumstantial evidence, but no direct evidence. There's some evidence that Hippolytus got his information from Egypt, and Clement was a bishop in Egypt. Clement he wasn't a bishop, he was a teacher in Alexandria. There's another author, Julius Africanus, who also seems to have settled on December 25th. And he wrote around the same time as Hippolytus. He was in Rome at the same time Hippolytus was in Rome, but we don't have any information about them actually interacting with each other. I gotta believe they would have, or at least read their material, but we don't have explicit evidence of it. But they all seem to be doing the same thing. They seem to think that Jesus was conceived on the Passover or vernal equinox, and therefore born 9 months later. But what they think the vernal equinox is different. Some of them thought it was March 25th. Some thought it was March 21st. And then they also had a different idea of when Passover was. And that seems to be the difference in their calculations. But their assumptions are the same. Jesus was conceived on the Passover, born 9 months later. It's just how they're reconciling those dates is what the difference is.
Thank you. Megan, do you want to do the next question?
Yes, thank you very much for that last one. For dating the birth of Jesus, would it be helpful to date the birth of John the Baptist, since we are told more details regarding his conception than we are of Jesus's?
This comes up a lot. Yeah, if you read the Gospel of Luke, Luke gives more information about John's conception than he does Jesus. And in the ancient church, starting in the late 300s and the 400s, they tried to justify December 25th as the date of Jesus based on when John the Baptist was conceived. So the argument goes like this. If you read the Gospel of Luke, it describes how John's father, Zechariah, was a priest. He was in the temple sacrificing when the angel of the Lord appeared and said that he and his wife would conceive and have a son. And that 6 months after that, Luke says, the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary, said that she was going to conceive. What that means is that Jesus is 6 months younger than John the Baptist. And as the reasoning goes, if you can figure out when Zechariah was in the temple on that very day, you could figure out when John was conceived. You could then figure out when Jesus was conceived. You could then figure out when Jesus was born. And the ancient church said they knew that. They said that Zechariah was the high priest, that he was in the temple on the Day of Atonement, I think. This was September 21st and 6 months, or September 25th, either one of those dates. And then 6 months later is March 25th. And the math just all works out. 9 months later is December 25th. The problem with that, though, is that Zechariah was not the high priest. He's clearly just a regular old priest. He's doing the daily sacrifices that could happen any day of the year. So that argument doesn't really work. The math is also squishy. There's a lot of assumptions, baked into this. You'll read people who will say that Zechariah and Elizabeth, of course, conceived immediately afterwards, after the angel appeared. But there's no, that's just an assumption. It could have taken months or weeks. We don't know. And there's a modern version of this argument, though. So the modern version assumes that Zechariah was a regular priest, like Luke says. Luke says he was in the order of Abijah. And this argument will state that we can figure out when the order of Abijah was serving in the temple, and therefore we can figure out when the angel would have appeared to Zechariah. But I'm still skeptical. I'm not convinced we can actually figure out when the order of Abijah was serving in the temple. It takes a lot of kind of tenuous leaps to get to that point. But even if we could, there's no reason to think that Zechariah would have conceived immediately, or Elizabeth would have conceived immediately and not months later, and that 6 months afterwards was a precise, 6 months and not just a general time frame. I mean, there's a lot of squishiness still with it. So I have friends who are convinced by this, but I'm not convinced by that idea. But it's certainly an old one that first emerges in the late 300s, early 400s in the ancient church.
Thank you. That's very interesting.
And our next reader question, I know from following the comments that several readers were pointing out and discussing this issue, but numerous readers pointed out that there were many Roman and pagan holidays which did occur on or around December 25th. Do none of them predate Hippolytus's claim?
Perceptive question. One of the issues with looking at Roman holidays is that the Romans had so many holidays that you get a Roman holiday a couple times a week on average. So any day that you select, any random day in a year is going to be on or near some holiday, almost by definition. So, and those are the official Roman holidays. If you go to the ones that were just local or regional, or that just had to do with one specific temple in one specific place, you're going to have every single day is going to have multiple Roman holidays associated with it. So as far as the actual official Roman holidays that occurred on or near December 25th, we've got a sampling of them. So the famous one is Saturnalia. Saturnalia, it was also very famous in Roman times. It wasn't just a regular run-of-the-mill holiday. It was a big deal. But that did not occur on December 25th. It occurred, it was either the 16th or 17th of December. And at some points, it would be extended by a couple days. At other points in Roman history, it might be extended 5, 6, 7 days. But in none of these cases does it actually overlap with December 25th. There's other holidays. There's Sigillaria. That was the last day of Saturnalia, but that's not on December 25th either. There's a couple others, but they're not on December 25th. The closest we can get is a festival called Bruma or Brumalia that predates Hippolytus of Rome. This is an ancient day in the Roman calendar. But this one is still difficult to peg. Bruma is a, Varro tells us this. He's an ancient writer. Bruma is just an abbreviated Latin form for the shortest. And it's meant to mark the shortest day of the year, which is the winter solstice, which the Romans usually thought of as December 25th. Sometimes they thought of it as the 22nd or 23rd or thereabouts. But the problem is that the evidence shows that the festival for Bruma was actually in November. That it seems to be what's going on is that the Romans started this festival when the moon would start to decline to the south in the sky, and they thought that the sun was declining in the south, and they believe that happened in November, right around Thanksgiving time for Americans, and so even this date is difficult to peg to December 25th. It seems to have been celebrated in November, and the celebrations seem to have been much later in Roman history. The earlier references to Bruma seem to be simply just an astronomical date, just like how astronomers today will talk about the equinoxes or the solstices. It didn't seem to have anything associated with it on the 25th. The other possibility is the feast of the sun god, Sol Invictus. And that was on December 25th, but it doesn't seem to have been instituted until the 300s or maybe the 270s AD, which is 50, 60 years after Hippolytus. So there's a lot of possibilities out there, but none of them seem to really match up.
Thank you. Our next question kind of, excuse me, adds on to that next one. How do we know that the Feast of Sol was only celebrated on the 25th later on time? Could it have possibly been celebrated earlier, just not recorded?
Another great question. Okay, so I guess the best way to answer this is to just present the evidence we have for the festival of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, the sun god, because it's quite intriguing. Our earliest evidence that the feast of the sun god occurring on December 25th, our earliest evidence comes from a document called the Chronography of 354 AD. And it says that there was a feast for Invictus. Now, it doesn't say Sol Invictus, the sun, the unconquered sun. It just says the unconquered one. Most scholars believe that it's referring to the sun god. I think they're probably right. There's evidence a couple decades afterwards that there was a feast for the sun on December 25th. So the question is, well, when was this instituted? And the evidence for that is that if you look at that calendar, the Chronography of 354, it gives chariot races for various festal days. And all the ancient festal days, the ones that have been in the Roman calendar for a long time, they all have the same number of chariot races. All the newer festal days have a different number of chariot races. And the Feast of Invictus has a different chariot race number. And so that implies that it's a newer addition. Another piece of evidence is that we have a lot of Roman cultural evidence remaining, and you would think that if this was an older feast, someone would have talked about it, and they don't. And so what scholars settle on is that it seems that it was probably instituted by Emperor Aurelian in the 270s, and that's because Emperor Aurelian dedicated the feast of the temple of the sun god in Rome. He also instituted a certain feast for the sun in October, and he also promoted solar worship, sun god worship. So it seems likely it was him. who instituted it in the 270s. Could it have been earlier? It's possible. We don't have evidence of that. What's ironic in all this is that same calendar, the calendar of 354, is also says that Jesus was born on December 25th. And so it's one of the great ironies is that the same document that's our earliest reference for the Feast of the Sun God on the 25th is also one of our first testimonies for the birth of Jesus on December 25th. And I show in my article that I think that the date for December 25th as the birth of Jesus, it comes well before then in Hippolytus, and I mentioned Clement of Alexandria and Julius Africanus in the early 220s. So what we can say with certainty is that our earliest evidence for the Feast of the Sun God comes from the 300s. It can plausibly be traced back to the 270s. Our earliest evidence for Christmas is certainly in the early 300s in the chronography of 354, but seems almost equally as certainly from Hippolytus. And it seems like we can trace him back a little earlier as well, plausibly to Clement of Alexandria. But this kind of brings up another possibility, is that I think your readers should be aware that, Rome was a big place. It was pretty diverse. People did a lot of the same things for different reasons. And so it's totally conceivable that some people celebrated the Feast of the Sun on certain days or other days, or some people liked Christmas because it reminded them of the sun god, but some people didn't. What seems clear is that Hippolytus and his fellow early Christians, that whether there was a pagan feast on December 25th or not, they don't seem to be concerned with that. They are doing biblical analysis to figure out when the world was created, because they think that that's when Jesus was conceived and therefore born 9 months later. And they don't, all of their discussions about pagan beliefs, especially in Hippolytus, he's very clear that Christians, from his point of view, should never participate in pagan celebrations. And Hippolytus died a martyr's death because of this stand. And we know that in later Christian history, in the 500s, 600s, we do have occasions where they would take pagan festivals and adopt them. But in the early church, the attitude was very different. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with pagan festivals. And so it just seems unlikely that someone like Hippolytus would have used a polytheistic date. It seems like he actually would have done the opposite. He would have run away from that date. So all that to say is, I think the fairest treatment of the evidence is that the Feast of the Sun God, Sol Invictus, was probably instituted in the 270s, that Christmas on December 25th, that date was batted around, different dates were given, but December 25th, which seems to have been first suggested by Hippolytus, maybe Julius Africanus in the early 220s, and that they were doing this not because of polytheistic beliefs, but because of their beliefs about biblical calculation and numerology. And later on, in later Christian tradition, in the 300s and 400s, you get statements that Jesus being born on December 25th shows that he's the light of the world shining in our dark earth, if you're in the northern hemisphere, on December 25th, the winter solstice. So that solar symbolism comes up as well later on in the 300s and 400s.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tom, for answering those questions. I mean, I think you did a wonderful job of elaborating through your answers on some of the key points from the article. I know I learned a lot just from listening to you, and I know our readers did too. And so I thank you for your time. Thank you for taking time to answer our readers' questions. And thanks to the readers for posing so many interesting questions to Tom. I'm sure he really appreciates it. So we really hope you enjoyed this live Facebook event. I hope we can do more of these with future issues of BAR, where we'll invite authors of our articles to answer some of your questions. Hopefully this will be a good forum for doing that. I would remind all of you listening live to definitely, if you're not already following or liking our Facebook or other social media accounts, whether that be Twitter or Instagram, please do that. You'll find you might enjoy a lot of the content that we post on a regular basis, on a daily basis. Also, please go to our website, www.biblicalarchaeologyreview.org, to make sure you subscribe to the magazine if you're interested, or our daily e-subscription newsletter. Please, we have lots of content that we generate every day, and we'd love you to follow us and like us as you can. So with that, thanks again to everybody. Thanks again to our audience, and especially to Tom for joining us today. And we will see you at our next Facebook Live event, everybody.